Mon nom est François Untitled, je suis le directeur de l'Institut EDS, au long Institut Hydro-Québec en environnement, développement et société, ici à l'Université Laval. Pour ceux qui ne le savent pas, l'Institut regroupe une 70 chercheurs d'une douzaine de facultés de l'Université Laval qui sont intéressés à des travaux interdisciplinaires, tant d'un point de vue de la recherche que de l'enseignement, pour ce qui touche les questions de l'environnement, le développement durable. C'est un grand plaisir pour nous d'ouvrir ce soir notre premier forum. C'est une nouvelle organisation, c'est une nouvelle réalité pour nous. L'idée de ce forum, c'est de donner une parole à nos collègues, une parole aux universitaires, pour leur donner une place pour exprimer leurs idées, pour partager leur expérience, tant en recherche qu'en enseignement concernant le développement durable, dans le but de favoriser des échanges et de créer un certain momentum, de chercher à encourager les gens à s'impliquer et à voir qu'il y a énormément de travail à faire, il y a de la place pour tout le monde peut y trouver son compte. J'ai le grand plaisir ce soir d'ouvrir ce forum avec une présentation particulièrement intéressante d'après nous. On a la chance d'avoir William Rees de l'Université de British Columbia avec nous. Monsieur Rees s'est vu décerner un doctorat honorifique par l'Université Laval en fin d'après-midi. C'est quelqu'un qui a marqué beaucoup le domaine de l'écologie, de l'économie, tout le concept de l'empreinte écologique, et qui a aussi beaucoup d'intérêt pour les questions d'organisation sociale liées à l'environnement et à la durabilité. J'avais cédé la parole, avant que M. Rees vous entretienne, cédé la parole à Étienne Leblanc, qui a la responsabilité d'animer la soirée. Donc, mon travail se termine ici. Pour moi, je vais pouvoir me joindre à vous et écouter la conférence. M. Leblanc, merci.
Alors, bonsoir. Donc, moi, je suis journaliste en environnement à Radio-Canada et on m'a offert d'animer cette soirée et je le fais vraiment avec grand plaisir, surtout de pouvoir assister à la conférence de M. Rees. Deux petits mots simplement sur le déroulement de la soirée. Très simple. M. Rees va faire sa présentation, 30-35 minutes à peu près. Vous prenez des notes, vous préparez vos questions et après ça, il y aura une période de questions qui sera ouverte dans la salle et les gens qui sont aussi à la maison, donc sur Internet, pourront aussi poser des questions. 15-20 minutes pour répondre à vos questions, avoir une bonne discussion sur ce qui sera dit ce soir. Voilà. Alors, bonne conférence. Monsieur Rees.
Merci, Étienne. Bienvenue, tout le monde. Les sujets dont je vous parlerai sont très complexes. Et pour cette raison, il faut que je parle en anglais. Mon français n'est pas assez bon pour expliquer tous les détails de ces sujets. J'ai honte. I'm going to talk to you in an interdisciplinary way. My entire career has been based on moving between disciplines, from sociology to cognitive biology, ecology, and even economics. I teach ecological economics. By the way, I want to invite you to interrupt me if I'm going too fast or you don't understand something. So please do ask any questions as we go, if that is convenient to you. I have been asked to talk a little bit about footprint analysis and to put it in this broad transdisciplinary perspective, and that's exactly what I'm going to do, but we're going to put it in the context that we're dealing with in sustainability. This is not a new problem. Back in 1992, this is when Rio, the first version of the Rio Conference was completed, the Union of Concerned Scientists published a statement, and I've taken a quote here, A great change in our stewardship of the earth and life on it is required if vast human misery is to be avoided and our global home on this planet is not to be irretrievably mutilated. Almost 20 years later, we hear from the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment a very similar warning. Human activity is putting such a strain on the natural functions of the earth that the ability of the planet's ecosystems to sustain future generations can no longer be taken for granted. Now, let us assume for the moment that these statements are true. This is our best science. How has the world responded? That's the question I want us all to be thinking about. Now, I will make the case that the world has not responded. And I believe it has not responded for this reason. We are inherently unsustainable. By that I mean the way the system works, it cannot be sustainable. Unsustainability is an inevitable emergent property of the systemic interaction, the interaction between techno-industrial society, which operates according to certain human-contrived rules, and natural systems, which operate according to fixed physical principles. Okay? And there is no way that the system that we have created with the beliefs, values, and assumptions that underlie it, there is no way that system can interact sustainably with the natural systems in the way that they behave. So there's a fundamental conflict between the way we think about systems and the way real-world systems operate. And both natural and biological factors are involved in creating this unsustainable situation. So for a moment, I'll speak as a biologist, and I want to underscore the importance of transdisciplinarity. Here is what biologists might tell us about this problem. Human beings are just like every other species. We're not conscious of it, but we have motivations that come to us from genetic predispositions to behave in certain ways. You all know that when it comes to eating or having sex or whatever, but it covers a lot of other ground as well. Humans have two qualities in particular that they share with all other species. We will expand to fill all the available habitat. There is no available land mass on this planet that does not now have a human population. Okay? We will use up all available resources. And if you think about Canadian development policy, it's all about exporting resources, getting rich as fast as we can on the basis of this principle of just using up all the available resources. How many of you have a credit card? Okay. Now, a credit card is a product of the mind that enables you to use up all available resources, called your income, and then even use more resources because we've invented a new form called the credit card. You see what I'm saying? We have this predisposition to consume everything available, and then when we're blocked by not having enough money, we invent plastic and do the same thing even more. Just an example, this is a graph showing the decline of the breeding stock of the North Atlantic cod, which was the world's largest and most important fishery, largely under Canadian control in the last few decades, and we drove it to extinction. And this is typical of how human beings manage resources. We drive them to extinction unless there's a very strong counterweight to prevent this from happening. This is the story of the world's fisheries. 80% of the world's fisheries are on this track right now. Okay? We will use up all those resources unless we impose the strongest of possible constraints on the system, and we are disinclined from doing that. So that's biology. We are predisposed to expand, and we will use up all resources under most normal circumstances. We set up competitive relationships that drives this even faster. On top of that, we have the cultural factor. This is nature and nurture working together to become unsustainable. We have created a social construction called the expansionist economics, the growth economy, which reinforces the natural tendency to grow and to use up all the available resources. So here are two statements from very well-known economists and business professors. Lawrence Summers was, at the time he made this particular statement, the chief economist of the World Bank. He became the president of Harvard University, and most recently was the President Obama's chief economic advisor, the chair of the U.S. President Council of Economic Advisors. Okay. Julian Simon, who died a few years ago, was a professor of management science at Maryland University. Summers: there are no limits to the carrying capacity of the Earth that are likely to bind at any time in the foreseeable future. Growth can carry on forever. Simon: we have in our hands now the technology to feed, clothe, and supply energy to an ever-growing population for the next 7 billion years. This is a mathematically challenged statement. It's an absurdity, and yet people repeat it as evidence that there's no problem. We can, through technology, replace the resources that we use up or become so efficient that we don't need any resources at all. That's how we believe, and this is how we operate, regardless of evidence to the contrary. Okay? So we can say this: I don't think anyone here can contradict this statement. Since the 1950s, virtually the entire world has come to share a myth. We construct social myths that determine our cultural behavior. We have come to share a mythic narrative of global development centered on unlimited economic expansion fueled by liberalized trade. This is the globalization story. We will freely trade everything and use up all the resources in order to grow more efficiently. Underneath this is another myth, that human well-being, le bien-être de la société, can be equated with ever-expanding income. We believe that it's necessary that income continuously increase for us to be happy. So we have then the worst of all possible situations from the point of view of species dynamics. We have a biological predisposition which was adaptive 100,000 years ago, 50,000 years ago, even 1,000 years ago, because it enabled us to survive in hard times, that propensity to expand and to use up the resources. But on top of that, we have a cultural myth that encourages us to do so. And because human beings are so technologically competent, we're better than any other species at using those resources. This is the result. When we discovered how to use fossil fuel in the 19th century, the human enterprise expanded explosively. You can see from this graph that for most of the past 2,000 years, there was no growth. And if we go back another 10,000 years, there was no significant growth. Things fluctuated, well, from your point of view like that, but no steady growth of this kind. But fossil fuel enabled us to acquire access to all other resources. Without fossil fuel, we could not produce the food we produce today. Without fossil fuel, we could not fish the oceans empty. Without fossil fuel, we can't get at the water that's deep under the ground. So fossil fuel enables us to acquire all the other resources needed to grow the human enterprise. And as a result, we now have a culture absolutely dependent on fossil fuel. And we're approaching, 7.2 billion people in the next year or so. But everything follows that same trend. These are a series of graphs showing that since 1750 in particular, but mostly in the last 50 years, it's explosive growth of just about everything on this planet. This is oil and fossil fuel generally. As I said, look how that curve resembles the population curve. The human enterprise is created because of this use of fossil fuel. These graphs are the same because they are completely tied together. The more fossil fuel we use, the more resources we consume, the more people we can support, and the more toys and artifacts that we can create. This is exponential growth, and it has a very interesting quality. Every doubling time consumes more resources than all the previous doubling times combined. So we have used about half of all the oil, coal, natural gas that has ever been produced in just the last 30 years. And if the global economy grows at just 2 or 3% for the next 35 years, we will use more energy in that period than we've used at all the previous times in history. This is a huge impact on a planet that is already beyond carrying capacity. Keep in mind that physics, basic physics tells us that any material that goes into a system has to come out of the system. So when the carbon in fossil fuel goes into our economy and we burn it, it comes out at the other end as carbon dioxide. So this curve again reflects these other curves, right? As we produce oil and consume it, carbon dioxide increases in the atmosphere. So here we see this enormous increase. We've gone from 280 parts per million in the 19th century to over 390 parts per million today. That's a 38 or 40% increase. We're changing the composition of the atmosphere of the planet. And we think this is a trivial exercise. Worse, because the rate of energy consumption is increasing, the rate of increase is increasing. So in the 1970s, carbon dioxide levels were rising at about 1.3 parts per million per year. Today, it's about double that. One consequence is global warming. This is by the way, these aren't models. These are actual measurements of carbon dioxide and temperatures. So even if you don't believe in the models of climate, these are real numbers. And they show an irregular increase in global temperatures. For some periods, there may be no increase because the oceans are absorbing much more water when there's a cool ocean surface temperature. At other times, the increase is quite remarkable. But the point is that in the last few years, the increase has continued. Globally speaking, the first 6 months of 2010 were the warmest ever recorded in the instrumental record. That year, 2010, tied with 2005 or 2008, they're all in the same ballpark, as the hottest year ever recorded. The world is on track. Right now, we are headed for at least a 4-degree increase in mean global temperature. 4 degrees means that most of China, most of India, a good part of South America, the southern half of the United States, Mexico, much of Africa will dry out. There will be the displacement of, well, maybe even 1 billion or more people if you start adding up the populations of those countries. This is a potentially catastrophic increase in global temperature, and we are on track right now to achieve it because the world is not directing its attention to this kind of problem. Okay? Now I want to stop here for just a moment to tell you a little bit about how my own awakening occurred. When I first went to UBC, I was a young PhD ecologist. I thought I had the solutions to all the world's problems. I was assigned to a task force to create a new institute for water resource management. Now, there were 30 members of that task force, and we did not know each other. So we decided to hold a series of seminars in which we would each give a short presentation to tell the others what our research interests were and what we could contribute to this new organization. Now, I didn't know anybody. I was new at the university. I'd only been there a year or so. I was suddenly struggling, trying to find my feet. So I picked a simple topic that I thought had great relevance. It was the topic of human carrying capacity. Carrying capacity is a population number. How many people can this region support or the world support? And I made a little model to show that my region of the province could support about 40,000 people. And I presented this to my colleagues. One of those colleagues was an economist. I had never had a course in economics. I didn't know any economists, but this was a very prominent, very well-known Canadian resource economist. And he came to me after my presentation and said, "Very interesting presentation. I want to take you to lunch." So we went to lunch, And he sat me down. He was very polite. He was very courteous. He was concerned about my future. But he said to me, should you persist in pursuing your research interests, this is burned into my brain, you have to understand, on human carrying capacity, your academic career will be nasty, brutish, and short. He then proceeded to tell me how economists had made the concept of human carrying capacity completely irrelevant. Because if human beings trade, why should this region be dependent on its local resources, its carrying capacity, if it can import food and energy and so on from other places and trade its surpluses out to those other places? So economists had a good theory of trade that showed every region could rise above its carrying capacity through the mechanism of trade. Moreover, with the proper workings of the marketplace, when a resource got scarce generally, rising prices would stimulate human ingenuity, and we would find substitutes for the declining resources. So he was utterly convinced and provided me with great courtesy a pile of literature this deep for me to read to learn how stupid I was. And so I did this. And I came to understand why economists are pro-growth. But about 2 years later, literally, it always bothered me as an ecologist, there's something wrong here. So one night I woke up in the middle of the night, boing, there's a light bulb above my head, and I figured out what was wrong. So carrying capacity is a question that asks how large a human population could be supported in a given area without damaging that area, without damaging the productive ecosystems. Now, if you can bring in resources, it becomes irrelevant. My economist friend was correct. There's no meaning in this statement. In fact, in my area, that I said had a carrying capacity of 40,000 people, even then there were 1 million living there, which he pointed out to me to show me how stupid I was. How can you say the carrying capacity is 40,000 when there's 1 million people living here? By the way, it's now 2.2 million. Right? But if you turn that carrying capacity ratio over and ask a different question, the question becomes, how large an area on the planet is needed to support that population wherever on Earth that productive territory is? So when you import food from somewhere else, you're importing land from halfway around the world. When you dump carbon dioxide into the atmosphere that is assimilated in a forest in South America, you're appropriating the carrying capacity of somewhere else. So now I had an idea that if I could monitor the trade flows in and out of a region and convert them to the land or the ecosystem base, whether it's in land or water, needed to produce those trade flows, I could ask this question in a different way. And we could compare the demand of people, the ecological footprint, as I called it, to the supply. Okay? And that's what we began to do. So every one of you, you're not aware of it, but you have an ecological footprint, an empreinte écologique. The ecological footprint is the area of productive ecosystems required to produce the resources that you consume and assimilate the wastes that you produce, wherever on Earth it is. So I'm standing here in a wool coat with a silk tie, and I have cotton socks. All of those things are produced by ecosystems somewhere. Every time you have a meal, you are making a claim on land somewhere that produces that food. And when you drive your car to work, you are pumping atmospheric gases that have to be assimilated if we're to be sustainable somewhere on the planet. And when we fish, we are using a productive part of the oceans. And we can now calculate, given the consumption of any population, an individual, a whole country, we can tell you how much of the Earth's productive potential is taken up to supply those people at the style to which they are accustomed. And we must recognize that the population is growing, per capita consumption is growing, so everybody's ecological footprint is expanding, but the available supply of productive ecosystems is shrinking. because we're overfishing, land is eroding, deserts are spreading, forests are being overharvested, in the tropics at any rate, and so on. So again, whether you are aware of it or not, we are beginning a huge global competition for the available carrying capacity. And right now, some of you may be aware that one of the great concerns that has emerged since 2008 is what we call land grabs, where rich countries are purchasing or leasing huge quantities of available land in poor countries. So China now has hundreds of thousands of hectares of Zaire and the Congo. And Saudi Arabia has huge chunks of North African land, growing food to export home. But it means the people in Congo and Zaire and so on don't have access to their own land base. So this is becoming a competition even in the marketplace for the declining supply of resources. When we compare across countries, we can realize that the economy becomes the vehicle by which we appropriate the productivity of other people's landscape, right? So each Canadian uses about 7 or 8 hectares of global average landscape. Each American, perhaps 10. But people in the poorest countries use a half of a hectare or perhaps a third of a hectare. So each of us needs 14, 15, even 20 times more of the world's output to supply us in the style to which we are accustomed than people in the poorest countries. Europeans generally use 2 or 3 times more than their fair earth share, and North Americans use 4 times their fair earth share. The fair earth share is obtained simply by dividing the total area of productive land by the total population. So on this planet right now, there are about 13 billion hectares of productive land and water. Most of the oceans are desert, for example. But this means when you divide by 7 billion people, each of us in an equitable world, in a fair world, you would be entitled to the product of about 1.8 average global hectares. And yet, to sustain an average Canadian, we need 3 or 4 times that amount. This is a graph showing the relative ecological footprints per capita of the world's countries. So we see Canada and the United States with very large footprints here, 8 to 9.5 hectares, roughly speaking. Here are the European countries and Japan, much more efficient, smaller countries. Whoa, I didn't mean to do that. They don't travel as much. Their vehicles and houses are smaller. The refrigerators and stoves are all smaller, so they have much smaller footprint. These are the emerging economies. We have China, Thailand, Peru, and so on here. And these are the poorest of the poor. Malawi, for example, at a half a hectare per person. This is the world average, 2.7 hectares. So on the planet today, if it was a completely fair or equal division of biocapacity, you are entitled to 1.8 hectares. The average person uses 2.7. So we are in a state of overshoot. Even on average, we're using more territory than is available on the planet. And you might ask, how can that be? And the answer is because we're drawing down the capital. You can withdraw more money from the bank than the bank is producing in interest, but only for a certain period of time. So this is a comparison of various countries where the red bar represents the per capita demand on biocapacity, and the green bar represents domestic supply. So here we have the United States, for example. It uses about twice the biocapacity that is available within the United States. Almost all of these rich countries in Europe are using vastly more. You see, people who think they live in Holland or in Japan, here's the Netherlands here with a very small biocapacity but big demand, very rich country. And Japan, even smaller biocapacity per capita, but a huge demand. These countries don't live, those people don't actually live in the Netherlands and Japan. In ecological terms, they're living on other landscapes elsewhere. Canada is very fortunate. We have a huge available biocapacity, and a very large eco-footprint. We're one of the few countries, there are only a handful of large countries that have a surplus. What I mean is we have more biological capacity than we are actually consuming as a people. On the other hand, you have to recognize, for every country that has an ecological deficit, they are using supply of surplus elsewhere. We export from Canada 1/2 of our productive forest land. We export from Canada 1/2 of our agricultural land in the form of food exports. So this is a false surplus. It's already taken up in the deficits that exist in other countries. When we add it all together, this is the trend over time, divided into components. The main thing is the human ecological footprint, and I must emphasize this, despite all the negotiations, despite all of the talk about sustainability, despite the climate treaties and so on and so forth, the human ecological footprint is steadily increasing, and sometime in the last 3 decades, it passed the point of sustainability, where we were living on one planet. We now require the equivalent of about 1.5 planets to sustain our current lifestyles. Now, even economists should understand what's going on here. This is simply a graph showing that in early stages of development, the utility of development is high and the cost is very low. So there's a net gain from growing in the economy. But as growth occurs, the marginal benefits decline and the costs increase. There's more environmental damage, social damage, and so on. And at some point, the two coincide. That's right in the middle where the asterisk is. That's the point at which economic growth should stop, because the costs of further growth equal the benefits, and there's no point in going further to the right, because when you go to the right, the costs are more than the gains. You would be stupid to undertake a process that costs you more than you acquire out of that process. And that is what we are doing on the planet today. It is arguable right now that in a global context, the costs of growth, which we do not monitor, nobody's adding up all these costs. I'm just saying that it's conceivable that the costs of growth already exceed the benefits. The problem is the benefits are going to a few people and the costs are being shared by billions of other people. And the few people who get the benefits are the ones in control. They have no incentive to change their ways because they're getting all of the gains from globalization, trade, and economic consolidation. What we see in the world today is an economy that is becoming more and more aggregate, in which there are more and more mergers and acquisitions, fewer and fewer large corporations controlling more and more of the wealth, so fewer and fewer people are benefiting from the growth, and more people are paying the costs. Okay. Now, this is a solvable problem if we recognize that human beings have certain qualities that should enable us to break from this. We have unparalleled capacity for evidence-based reasoning. If what I'm saying is true, and there's tons of science to evidence that, then why aren't we paying attention? Because we have that ability to reason out of the data. We have a unique ability for long-term forward planning to change our own future. We can exercise moral judgment. Is it morally correct for some of us to use 8 times the share of the planet, or 4 times when other people are starving? We should exercise compassion for individuals and for other species. So these are unique qualities. The first 2 are completely unique to humans. The second 2 we have to a much greater degree than any other species. Nevertheless, despite these being qualities unique to humans, and despite the hardening evidence, no country, no government, no major corporation, no prominent international agency anywhere has begun to advocate in public, let alone implement the kinds of policy responses that are called forth by the best available scientific data. So we have to ask ourselves, what is the disconnect between what we know and what we do in response to that knowledge? Here's a big one for people in education. To the extent that higher education reproduces the core beliefs, values, and assumptions of our contemporary growth-oriented techno-industrial society, it is a source of the problem. So if our school systems, if our universities, and our departments of commerce and economics and engineering keep producing the way of thinking that generates this problem, then we are as responsible as any group for the problem. David Orr is a very prominent American environmental educator. You can download this paper from the net. He says, the depletion and pollution of the planet is not the work of ignorant people. It's largely the result of work by people with BAs, BSCs, LLBs, MBAs, and PhDs. Okay? So it's not the poor who are destroying the planet. It's the wealthy, competent people who engineer the demise of the Earth. Gary Schneider is a very well-known environmental poet in the United States. He made a similar statement. It is people who make unimaginably large sums of money, and by the way, they're getting bigger and bigger every year in the corporate banking sector and so on. People who are impeccably groomed, excellently educated at the best universities, male and female alike, who orchestrate the investment and the legislation that is ruining the world. In Canada today, we are seeing legislation in the House of Commons that is eviscerating the environmental evaluation process. We're seeing the Fisheries Act gutted, so we no longer can enforce the protection of fisheries habitat, and so on and so forth. Deregulation is resulting in the legislation that is resulting in the destruction of the world. Now, I mentioned we have this conflict between what we do and what we know. And I think, this is me speaking as a biologist, that we need to understand this is another discipline, what we refer to as cognitive psychology or neurocognitive biology. How does the brain work? And this is a very crude model, but it's in its general form has been reaffirmed. We really have three subdivisions in our brain. The top part, the cerebrum, is the human addition, or at least it's more developed in human beings than in any other species. The cerebrum is where we think, it's where we have linguistic skills, it's where we plan. So this part of the brain is unique to humans. 66% of the human brain is in the cerebrum, the neocortex, or new brain. But it's overlain, it's an evolutionary overlay on top of two earlier brain phases of development. The limbic system is shared with some other organisms that are able to express emotion, feelings, bonding to their offspring, and so on. Okay? We have that, but so do birds and mammals to a greater or lesser degree. But even underlying that is something called the reptilian brain stem, or the old brain. This is the seat of instinctive responses, territorial defense, the fight or flight response, and so on. So in a very crude way, the brain, it's much more complicated than this, but you understand there's a thinking part, there's a feeling part, and there's an instinctive domain of the brain. And these all interact together in a way that we are not fully conscious of, because we only live in the cerebral cortex. We don't really know what's going on below, even though it may be influencing what we think. Thoughts can produce emotions, which can produce instinctive responses. Emotions can produce thinking. So all of these things are interrelated in some way. But the point is, we never know at what point, what part of the brain is in control. So we claim to be a uniquely self-conscious and rational species. Remember I said we have the capacity for rational thought. We live in our cerebral self-consciousness or awareness, but circumstances in which reason predominates are limited to relatively trivial circumstances. Passion and instinct trump reason. Now, and even in simple ways, you know this. How many of you have ever gone to an all-you-can-eat buffet? Okay. You swear that you will have one plate and that's it. And then you find yourself going back for the second or the third plate. You see, you have an instinctive urge for sugar, fat, and what else? Salt. And buffets provide all of that. And you are driven to override you know you shouldn't do this, but you're going to do it anyway. And there's many other circumstances. If you look into your life, you will find many circumstances in which you do things that are against your better judgment because you're really under the influence of emotional or instinctive chemistry that forces us to act in such ways. I've got tons of material to demonstrate this. We are a deeply conflicted species. We are constantly battling among our intellect and our hormonal and our instinctive responses. And I think this cartoon really captures it. This is a board of commerce or a board of trade meeting. They have a guest speaker who's just described the horrible state of the world. And he says, so while the end of the world scenario is rife with unimaginable horror, we believe that the pre-end period will be filled with unprecedented opportunities for profit. So this is Canada. We know that we are on a per capita basis as responsible for global change as any people on this planet. We know that. We know the possible consequences, but we put it aside and get on with the opportunities for profit. The development of the pipelines, the oil, the gas, the agricultural land can all go to hell as long as you can make a great deal of money in the process. Now, what I'm saying is we live in a state of deep denial that is an inherent property of the way the brain works. And we've known about this for a very long time. Gustave Leblanc, a French psychologist in the 19th century, wrote a book. In English, it's called The Crowd, a Study of the Popular Mind, in which he wrote many, many wonderful things to extract from it. But I think this really captures it. The masses have never thirsted after truth. We turn aside from evidence that is not to our taste, preferring to deify error. So if we're in a comfortable situation, we will do that no matter what the evidence says. We will deify, that is to make a god out of what we're doing while ignoring the other. Derek Jensen is a popular American environmental philosopher. He wrote something very similar. Listen to this and ask if it does not describe we in this country today. For us to maintain our way of living, we must tell lies to each other, especially to ourselves. The lies act as barriers to truth. The barriers are necessary because without them, deplorable acts would become impossibilities. If we really admitted that climate change is a fact and it will damage the lives of millions, if not billions of people, could we possibly continue to develop oil and gas just for our short-term profit in clear conscience? This is immoral. It shows that while we have the capacity to make moral judgments, we decline to do so once we are in deep denial and simply putting aside the consequences of our own actions. Even scientists have recognized that within the disciplines of the sciences, truth takes a long time to invade the current received discipline. So Max Planck, the great physicist, said, a new scientific truth does not triumph by convincing its opponents and making them see the light, but rather because its opponents eventually die and a new generation grows up that is familiar with it. So we seem to get stuck in certain positions, certain ways of believing that make it impossible for us to appreciate, to receive, and to act out of the knowledge that we have. Now, again, we go into cognitive biology for an explanatory mechanism. I recommend a book called Brain and Culture by Bruce Wexler. It describes the phenomenon of brain development. And what current studies show is that as a young person grows up in a particular social milieu, they acquire the beliefs, the values, the assumptions, the popular ideology, the cultural narrative, as it were, of that culture, because we hear it over and over and over again. That's why Canadians are different from Malawians and so on, right? It becomes then the means by which the brain forms synaptic circuits. The exposure to certain experiences, to certain beliefs, values, and assumptions literally helps to create circuitry in the brain And once those circuits are established and contain that person's way of thinking, this is what happens, a direct quote. Subsequently, people seek out compatible experiences. And when faced with information that does not agree with their preformed internal structures, the synaptic circuits in the brain, we deny, discredit, reinterpret, or forget that information. How many of you think of yourselves as environmentalists? Okay. Now, you are all here at this meeting to have your beliefs reinforced, all right? No one here is a rabid industrialist intent on the growth model. So in a sense, it's a simple experiment that tells what I'm talking about. So the question of the day, I'm being told it's all over, so are there any? Okay, I'm just questioning. These are the true potentials of humankind. What would a truly intelligent, compassionate, forward-thinking, planning-capable species do in response to the historical record? I mean, listen, rise to the challenge of being a human and stop acting like some kind of defensive reptile is all I'm really arguing here. First of all, we have to acknowledge that the dominant growth narrative is flawed. This is a problem. We cannot have continuous material growth on a finite planet that's shrinking, in effect. Okay? We have constructed a model which is completely against the nature of reality. The great educational philosopher Popper said something the same. We've constructed a model, it's an interpretation, but what the scientists and the lunatics theories have in common is that they're both constructions, they're both conjectural, but some constructions are better than others. We have to replace the growth model with something else. So the challenge for us in education in the universities is to write a new, better, more realistic and adaptive cultural narrative. The economic policy emphasis must shift from efficiency and growth, which means just getting bigger, not getting better, toward equity and development, which means qualitative improvement, getting better. Getting better is better than getting bigger. The underpinning values of society must shift from competitive individualism, greed, and narrow short-term self-interest toward community, cooperation, and collective interests in survival. Sustainability is a collective problem requiring collective solutions. If every one of us did everything we could as an individual to solve the problem, it would make very little difference. Maybe 10% of our footprint would disappear. Here's the truth that we have known for decades. Industrialized world reductions in material, energy, and environmental degradation of 90% will be required by 2040 to meet the needs of a growing population fairly within the carrying capacity, the ecological capacity of the planet. Now, that's a statement from the International World Business Council on Sustainable Development back in the 1990s. Our work on eco-footprinting isn't quite as scary as that, but it's scary enough. For sustainability with equity, wealthy countries in the OECD should be taking steps now to reduce energy and material consumption by 50 to 80%. That's what we need. And we either do it or the planet continues to deteriorate, ultimately taking us down. Why should we do these things? Because for the first time in the history of our species, our individual interests are united with our collective interests. I can't survive without you surviving, and nobody on the planet is going to make it unless we come together to confront these problems. Failure to act for the common good will ultimately lead, and we are seeing the leading edge evidence of this already, will lead to civil insurrection, resource wars, and ecological destruction. The Occupy Wall Street movement is the first indication, even in the wealthy North American context, of civil discontent with the inequity and deteriorating social conditions that accompany ecological decay. Moreover, it should be easy to stop growing because we're not benefiting from it anyway. This is simply one of many graphs showing that for the first few increments of income increase, things get better, then it flattens out. So countries way out at $60,000 per capita per year are no better off in terms of longevity or any of the other indicators than countries making $15,000 a year. But if everybody goes to $30,000 or $40,000 a year, we destroy the planet. There's no point. There is an optimal economic scale, at which point you've achieved all the value you're going to get, and there's no point in growing on. In Canada, just to be example, between 1976 and 2006, the economy grew by 130%. GDP per capita is up 70%. Yet, despite the fact we say growth is necessary to solve problems and to create unemployment or employment, there has been no change in the percentage of the population in poverty or in the unemployment rate. So we've doubled the economy for no gain. Actually, there's more people poor and more people out of work than ever before. Subjective well-being, people's feelings about themselves, are constant or declining. We're not gaining from this model. It's a serious problem because wrong ways of thinking, maladaptive memes are just as bad as genetic mutations. They will be selected out. If we keep acting stupidly, nature will take the civilization down. Whole societies have already failed because they didn't pay attention. There's a wonderful book by Joseph Tainter called The Collapse of Complex Societies. What Tainter concludes is, what is perhaps the most intriguing element in the evolution of human societies is the regularity with which the pattern of increasing complexity is interrupted by collapse. We are the same species doing the same thing as other societies, only now it's global instead of local, right? So whereas Rome collapsed and Egypt collapsed and so on and so on, now the world will collapse if we don't shape up. So the real sustainability challenge is for global society to break from the historic pattern of ignominious collapse. Why? Because we have the intelligence, we have the capacity to plan, we have the ability to make morally correct judgments, and we should be compassionate for each other. Thank you very much.
Hi, Professor Rees. I'm a PhD in law. My question is about the notion of emergence that you mentioned at the beginning of your presentation. I don't have a background in science, but my understanding is that this is the point where humanity switches from being sustainable to unsustainability. Now, can you give us an idea of where this point happened, where this switch happened in history? Is it, as you mentioned, when we started consuming fossil fuels? Is it when we invented agriculture or the first tool?
Well, it's all of those things. It's the point at which the rate of material, the rate of material and energy consumption by the human enterprise, that's the aggregate of all people and cultures on Earth, exceeded the rate of production in nature. So as soon as you are in a situation where you are destroying, in physical terms, more negentropy than nature can produce, you're in an unsustainable state. Think about it this way. If you have a bank account with $1 million and its interest is 2.5%, you will earn $25,000 every year. And if you spend only $25,000 a year, you can do that forever. You are sustainable because every year your bank account will produce $25,000 and the capital will remain the same. But as soon as you cross the line and spend $26,000, $28,000, $30,000, your capital starts to shrink and the amount of money generated each year is less and less and less, and then suddenly you're out. You crash because there's not enough capital there to sustain your current level of expenditure. And that's what we're doing on the planet right now. The ecological systems can produce at 2 or 3% per year. We're consuming 4 and 5% per year. So we've crossed the tipping point and we're on the downhill slope. I think it happened about 1970, 1980, in that range.
Thank you.
Dr. Rees, I have maybe a last question for you, because you were talking about how scientists should go on public dialogue and speak out. For those who are going to be scientists or any academic jobs that they will have, and if they work for the government in the context we live in right now with all the cutbacks, what should they do? to be involved in the public and speak out when they can?
Well, what am I doing? I'm standing here speaking out. I'm a scientist. Now, admittedly, I'm a university scientist, but I think more of us ought to be doing what I'm talking about. You don't have to agree with me, but at least we have a dialogue. And perhaps some of you have seen things tonight that you didn't quite think of before. And that's what education is all about, where we begin to weigh different ways of looking at things. The government is cutting back on science precisely because it is in denial, right? It doesn't want to know. You see, if we have good science, it wouldn't allow us to do the kind of global development effort that we're doing today with oil and gas and exporting all of our resources. Good science, good political philosophy would change those policies. Well, the government doesn't want those policies changed because they're taking their orders from a different sector of society. So in order for the government to have good scientists and to not cut programs, we need a well-educated, politically engaged population that will insist that the scientific body in the public sector be sufficiently strong to monitor the performance of the private sector, for example. We're not even going to have enough food inspectors to tell you your food is going to be safe after this latest round of cuts. So we are a society that's bleeding, and we're not really conscious and aware enough of it to take to the streets yet. But I think eventually that's what it will come down to. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I think it's very food for thought. Thank you.